one way of saying it. You're unburdened of what has been, if you're a Hebrew, and
you're
getting that reference. So we can use that now because it seems we're being unburdened by what has been, and crossing over, and you leave things behind and you take on new things. But very often within Christianity, it's a lot of old stuff that people take on. It's a lot of old religious things or tradition. And what is it the Spirit wants to do? Well, interestingly enough, back in the late 1800s, we have this thing of this modern Zionist movement that came with Theodor Herzl, and it was the beginning of Israel becoming a state again 50 years later. But at the same time, Messianic Judaism, or what was called Hebrew Christianity, started coming back after being around. It was always hidden, but, with all the persecutions and everything, it wasn't so good. You couldn't be a Jew or a Christian. And so those who were both sort of hid things. They may have been publicly Christian because they were allowed to, but secretly Jewish. There's a lot of people, if you talk to today, who come from a Catholic background, especially because there was great persecution in the Catholic countries. It's one of the reasons I thought that Christopher Columbus actually took off for the New World, because I don't know if you know this, but Christopher Columbus was Jewish.
Yeah.
And actually a Messianic Jew. And so it wasn't, there was a lot of persecution. There were a lot of problems. And so many of these things got lost. But you'll hear people talk about that they come from a Catholic tradition, but we didn't eat pork. Or my grandmother lit candles on Friday night. I have no idea why, but we do. And why this was that there were a lot of what are called conversos, where they were Jews who were converted. But now, interestingly, as we come into this modern era, there's a lot of Christians who are not Jews at all, but are starting to understand things from a Hebraic perspective and seeing the depth of it, understanding Jesus, Yeshua, in a much deeper way, understanding the scriptures. By the way, try to understand Paul, who says many things that are hard to understand without a Hebraic mind and an understanding of like Pharisaic culture and stuff. I guarantee you're getting it wrong, no matter how much you think you're getting it right. Why? Because this is the way Paul thought. And Paul was brilliant. And if you don't think along these lines, I'm not saying in any way you're not saved or that you don't have a personal relationship with Jesus. I'm just saying you're missing stuff that I have found through my walk of almost 30 years really, really valuable. And so these are things that we're seeking to bring to you. And so we've started a couple different structures for these talks, these discussions that Jim and I have on air. And this one is called Messiah in the Middle. And today, starting in the next segment, because I'm going to give a news update of something I've been covering every week for the past few weeks here, is we're going to be talking about Sabbath rest. And what is it from a Jewish perspective? What has it been from a Christian perspective, or maybe, rejected in a way from a Christian perspective? And then, as we love to do, Messiah makes all things one and brings this unity to us, is really where does the truth lie between these traditions and really in the truth of Messiah and who he was and who he is. So going to talk about in this section, again, we'll get the Sabbath rest and Messiah in the middle in the next one, is regarding this ongoing story about our mayor, Yemi, and this hate crime hoax. And I'm going to keep you updated on it because more than anything else, this has to deal with truth. And so I'll let you know that if you haven't heard the story, and maybe you haven't, because our local papers, they're starting to sort of kind of talk about it, but not really. About 2.5 weeks ago, the Daily Wire broke an article out nationally that Mayor Yemi Mobilati, that this hate crime that happened during the mayoral campaign here in 2023 in Colorado Springs, that it was a hoax and that there are federal charges against 3 people. Well, this Daily Wire came out a week later saying that Mayor Yemi, it was done to his benefit. It was done as a hoax to try to get sympathy for him and get more votes for him supposedly by the people who did it. It's still federal charges, hasn't gone to trial yet. That he knew about it before, during, and after. And when the FBI came to interview him, he lied about it. And so, of course, what should the media be doing? Well, our mayor has been accused of something really, really grievous, and we should be looking into it. We're part of the investigation with law enforcement, of course, doing that. But we really owe the public to look into it. But what has happened, to update you, and you can look on this, Mayor Yemi did come out on Friday and do a Facebook Live for about 10 minutes saying that he did not lie to the FBI. And that he didn't want to say much more, and there hasn't been much more. And then a couple more articles came out. Finally, the Gazette, after 2 weeks, finally came out with an article. It's like they were ignoring it for 2 weeks. And also the Colorado Springs Independent. But what was interesting about these articles is, rather than digging into the question of whether or not it actually is true, these charges, both of them attack the messenger. And that's not really something media should do. That's something public relations does. And so this is getting, as much as we need to know, if Mayor Yemi is innocent, he needs to be cleared quickly, and this shouldn't hang over him or the city. If he's guilty in some way, he should be held appropriately accountable. I think we all agree to that. But the media that's supposed to be covering this, investigating it, and bringing us the information so we can make a judgment about whether we think this is true or not, has been almost all of them trying to ignore it. It seems that way. I don't know how else to explain it. And so this actually, and we should be really concerned about this locally as people who walk in truth, right? We represent truth. And that the media is supposed to be the prophetic voice of a community. It is the prophetic. We proclaim what's supposed to be truth, or we're false prophets that don't, or we're silent when we're supposed to speak up. We run to Nineveh when we're supposed to go there. What is the implication if our media is really operating with this, not just nationally like we saw during the elections, but locally? What stories aren't we getting? And how are they deciding winners and losers? Who gets reported on and who doesn't? What are they not telling us? If a story, and I'll say it's juicy, your mayor gets accused of something on a national level, your responsibility as the local journalist is to investigate it. But it hasn't been going on. And I think more than whatever the results are when the truth comes out about the accusations against Yemi, we have to be thinking about, is the media actually being the purveyors of truth that they're sworn to be in our community? I'm Chaim Goldman. You're listening to Crosswalk. When we come back with Pastor Jim Pierce and Sabbath Rest.
All right.
Woo!
Good.
That was rapid fire there. Okay. I'll eat some shawarma, people.
Some shawarma.
I love me some shawarma. And that's truth. I cannot lie.
All right. This is going to be fun.
Okay. So I will read Genesis 2:3.
Okay.
And Exodus 28 through 11.
Okay. And then I can do the story about
and then hand it over to you.
Sure.
And I forgot to mention the website for the hate crime hoax thing, which should have been in that segment, but I will mention that too.
So I'm just going to introduce a little bit to the people online real quick here. So I'm at the radio station studios here in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and we are doing a show called Crosswalk, normally hosted by a couple other pastors here in town. And then Monday nights, Chaim invited me to join him. And so tonight we're going to be talking about the Sabbath. What is the Sabbath rest? And how do we relate to the Sabbath rest?
So what are you
Huh?
Are you talking to people?
Yeah, I'm just doing an intro. Yeah.
Okay.
In our little, so we're actually in a radio studio here in Colorado Springs, and so we will not be taking any live comments or inviting anybody onto the live. We're just going to be doing the radio show, and you get to sit in the catbird seat and watch us do the show. It's going to be fun. And, so, and just for a little background, I met Chaim about 7 years ago. He lived in Israel for several years and did lots of media production across the Messianic / Hebrew Roots community for years. moved his family here several years ago in Colorado Springs, and continues to operate in media and doing news and information. He did it was amazing. He did a Passover at a local church here, had over 300 people show up at a Christian church for Passover. That's amazing. That blows my mind. And just talking about how Passover interconnects with Yeshua, Jesus. And he also has an excellent teaching he's done in the past, but I think it's online as well, for his website, his YouTube channel, where he talks about Hanukkah and the
And that is coming up.
yeah, that's coming up, in the Maccabean revolt, and he's got some great material on that. So we'll get his YouTube. What's your YouTube channel?
Repairing the Breach.
Oh, that's right, Repairing the Breach on YouTube.
Yeah, there's others, but if you look for, it's called "What Miracle Happened There."
Okay.
On Hanukkah.
Okay, so Repairing the Breach: What Miracle Happened There. That's the story of Hanukkah, as Chaim teaches it.
Unconventional Hanukkah story.
Yes, it's extremely well done. I watched it several times. And you were interrupted during it a couple times too, if I remember right. It was fun stuff.
Okay.
All right, we got 30 seconds before we go back on air. Okay, coming back on air in a minute.
Welcome back to Crosswalk. I'm Chaim Goldman, the Watchman. We are doing another Messiah in the Middle with Pastor Jim Pierce of Springs of Living Water Church here in Colorado Springs. And what is Messiah in the Middle? Well, we look at a biblical topic from a Jewish perspective, as I'm a Messianic Jew, and Jim is a Christian and leaning toward, Hebraic understanding that he's been studying for about 7 years now. And so this is a great way for us to bring these worlds together and have you understand sort of the arguments that separate us. But Messiah in the middle, when we meet in the middle over Messiah, that's where the unity comes. That's where the understanding comes. And very often we find that when we're arguing about stuff, we actually are in agreement. We're just passionately seeing, like 6 blind men and the elephant. We're passionately seeing a truth. And if we would look at it, and I'll tell you Hebraically, and this is, I guess I skipped this, part in the last time we did it, but I always generally do this understanding of the difference between a Hebraic mindset or understanding or way of interpretation versus what we would call like a Western Greek mindset, is that the Western Greek mindset tends to see things as right or wrong. Whereas the Hebraic mindset so it's an either or situation. And when you get in a discussion, it's like, well, I have to prove that I'm right or I'm wrong. And of course, nobody wants to be wrong. And then there's this battle going on.
Right.
Whereas the Hebraic tends to be this and this, that we're trying to describe God. And like, do you have all of that truth? And I have none of it. Like maybe I see a piece and you see a piece. Not that there aren't ways that are wrong. Like that's a really important thing. I'm not saying all true, everything is true.
Right. But
very often the reason that we're so heated in these theological arguments is we know something's true and the other person knows something's true. And the only reason you're having an argument is because you think that those truths are mutually exclusive. And yet they can be reconciled when we come and reason together. Maybe come and reason together is what we should call this thing, because that's what you and I do every week. So that's my background. Jim, give a little bit more on your background, and then I'm going to read some verses about the Sabbath, and we'll get into it.
Sure, yeah. For me, coming from Calvary Chapel, as a Calvary Chapel pastor for several years, Calvary Chapel, Eric Cartier does the show during the week. Great pastor, great ministry, and Calvary Chapel across the board is very biblically sound, biblically grounded. But I've kind of began to embrace a little bit more of what Chaim described as this Hebraic worldview versus our Greco-Roman Western worldview, and starting to integrate back into my theology, my understanding of the scriptures. More of a Hebraic understanding, and try to bring us back to some degree what was 1800 years ago, and bring the two testaments back together instead of separating them and throwing one out.
Supposedly it's one Bible.
It is one book.
Now I'll give my disclaimer, and then Jim will give his trigger warning, because we've just found we have to do this, or there's no chance that people hear us the right way. This has nothing to do with your salvation, whether or not, like we're going to discuss Sabbath rest.
Right.
Whether or not you take the Sabbath, you believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. I believe that you'll want that Sabbath rest. It's a gift, right? Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But every time a Messianic Jew speaks, people hear, if you don't do this, you're going to hell. And I'm not saying that at all, because our salvation is nothing that we could ever earn. There's nothing that we could do. It's a free gift. But once we're redeemed with a price, and once we're bondservants, and once we're not our own anymore, I believe that we're to step into this world where we're obedient to God, and that we're to take everything that he has for us. And the greatest gift ever, in my opinion, is the Sabbath. And it said, as much as Jews have kept the Sabbath, Sabbath has kept the Jews. So please hear that I'm trying to add and not take anything away, and that nothing that I'm saying is, if you don't do this, X, Y, Z. Well, I'll tell you, if you don't do this, you may not have a Sabbath rest. I'd love you to have one, because there's nothing better. Jim, your trigger warning?
Yeah. So what I like to do when I talk about something that's a little controversial is, when I do my TikTok videos, or my YouTube videos, or even at our church, I like to give people a trigger warning. Here's your trigger warning. If you're not used to having your long-held religious and cultural beliefs challenged by what the Word of God actually says, brace yourself, because it will change you if you listen.
Buckle up. Okay, so Genesis 2 and verse 3. And Elohim blessed the seventh day and set it apart, because on it he rested from all his work, which Elohim, God, the power that created everything, he created to make. And it's interesting, people say, well, what did God create on the seventh day? Right? Because he created on the 6 days. The answer is he created rest, which is really, really interesting. So God did do something on the seventh day. So Exodus 20, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day and set it apart. 6 days you labor and shall do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of Yehovah, your Elohim. You do not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days Yehovah made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in it, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore Yehovah blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy, or set it apart. He set it apart. And so we get this commandment way after Genesis, that we are to set this apart because God set it apart, and it is a day of rest. In the next segment, we're going to be talking about differences of interpretation between Judaism and Christianity on this subject. What is rest? What does it mean to rest? What does that word mean in the Hebrew, and things like that? But overall, we know that God, he didn't say that the other 6 days were bad. We work on those days. They're common. But then there's this set apartness that happens on the seventh day. Jim?
Yeah. So I was heard a rabbi teach on the subject. He wasn't a believer in Yeshua, but he basically said that he says the way they describe the Sabbath rest, the rules concerning the Sabbath, it's a mountain that hangs by 3 threads. And I was like, oh, this is intriguing. What does that mean? He says, well, because according to the Torah specifically, not the additional instructions, there's basically 3 rules that God says. No work, which means you're supposed to rest. No lighting a fire or kindling a fire, and have that day set apart for a holy convocation. Mikra is the Hebrew word. And those are the 3 things. And then they added up to 1,500 laws. I was talking to my friend, a rabbi here in town, an Orthodox rabbi, and he showed me his library, 6-foot-long bookshelf. All those were laws concerning the Sabbath. And they're thought out. They wrestled with them for literally thousands of years. And their goal is to serve God with their whole heart, their whole soul, and with their whole mind. And then they make a bunch of rules on how to achieve that.
And we'll talk about that in the next section. Don't know that they're wrong, but I would say there is another about that bake what you shall bake and boil what you shall boil. And this was given regarding the manna and the original, and that is extended down too of not cooking on the Sabbath. But honestly, and again, we'll get into this, but from a straight reading of the Torah, uh, there are about, yes, 5, 6, 7 things on the Sabbath.
Right.
But it can be very individualistic how you interpret it. But like any good religion does, it systematized things so that a community could observe it together. Because I'm telling you, if you're trying to like hang out in your hammock and rest on Sabbath, and your neighbor is mowing his lawn, it's not so easy. So it is better. All of these things are better lived out in community, and Judaism was worked very hard to do that. The other thing is it's said within, is this thing called Shomer Shabbos, which is you're asked within Judaism, like if you're a Jew and a religious Jew, as they say, are you Shomer Shabbos? You observe the Sabbath, you guard the Sabbath, because there are many Jews who don't. And this is really like the dividing point of like someone who's a religious Jew and someone who's not. And you know what shomer means? It means to guard. So it's observing it and guarding it. Why do we guard it? Well, you got to guard something that's valuable, and you got to guard something that someone's trying to take away from you. And I would argue that for the most part, we take the Sabbath from ourselves. We're the ones who rob. We have to guard it to make sure. It's a mental game. Right. It's a physical game, and it's not legalistic. It's quite individualistic, and it's wonderful. And ever since I started doing it as a believer, not as a secular Jew, but as a believer about 30 years ago, I would never, ever give it up. And I know Jim feels the same way.
Yeah.
And so when we come back in this Messiah in the middle talking about Sabbath rest, we're going to talk about a general Jewish perspective regarding the Sabbath versus a Christian one. And then at the end of the show, of course, we bring them into a unity in Messiah. I'm Chaim Goldman, the Watchman. You're here with Pastor Jim Pierce of Springs of Living Water Church on Crosswalk, and we'll be right back. Do you like where it's going?
Yeah,
Am I doing too much? Am I taking away your content?
No, it feels good.
You're covering stuff?
It feels good, yeah.
Okay. I got so much to say on stuff that I just keep going. Okay.
I'm going to do some...
Administration has hinted at one of its boldest moves yet, America's return to the gold standard.
Am I on camera eating food?
Oh, I flipped it. Oh, I can flip it back.
No, it's okay. Eating grapefruit.
There you go. Some delicious shawarma.
Well, I got left as a grape leaf, but they're very good.
Specializes in helping those with a 401k, IRA, or other types of retirement accounts. So crypto control to move some of their savings into physical gold. Today, they hope to send you a free gold stamping kit to help you decide if this process is right for you. Call 606.
All right.
80,000 to take advantage of current rollover policies. Early action on physical gold.
So just so people know who are in the video audience, we're just on a commercial break at the radio station here. And so we kind of go over our notes and think a little bit about what we're going to talk about next. And that's what we're doing now. That's why we're quiet. So we talked about it's a creation ordinance. Is it for Jews and Gentiles? Well, it's a good thing to take a rest.
It's one of the 10 Commandments.
It is. It is in the 10 Commandments. I forgot about that.
It's in the top 10.
It's in the top 10. David Letterman would do it in the top 10. In that holy convocation, 23 times. Mikra.
Great news. You decide to see if you can save money bundling at Progressive.com and enjoy more lunches far away from Kyle. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company affiliates and other insurers not available in all states. I'm Jason Lupo. I'm Aaron Lupo. And together we
Alrighty.
for this freedom on 100.7 The Word every Saturday at 9. culture and equip you with information and insights to protect your family in the field. And information on local policy, national policy, and state policy that is affecting your health, your kids, and your family. We want to make sure we bring you all of the latest research and advice that is going to help you and your family in your community. This week on Pathway to Victory.
Hey, I've been in production all afternoon. I'll get back to you this evening. Period. That should probably work, but I need to check my schedule.
So Shabbat in Hebrew, Shin Beit Tav, Shabbat. Shin would be the teeth, or it's Shomer, or
So you're gonna get the pictograms again?
what's that?
Gonna do the pictogram stuff?
I could. I was just trying to figure out a good way to explain it clearly.
Yeah, we're back. Welcome back to Crosswalk. I'm Chaim Goldman, the Watchman. We're doing Messiah in the Middle with Pastor Jim Pierce of Springs of Living Water Church here in the Springs. And let's see, I'll give out your website, springsoflivingwater.co.
That's us, yeah.
Springsoflivingwater.co. And I grew up secular Jewish for the most part, knew I was Jewish. We kept the holidays basically, not a lot of faith, but about 30 years ago, coming up in January, I became a believer and all this stuff became very real for me. But it was like, well, but, Jesus was, spoiler alert, Jesus was Jewish. And, what were they talking about? And is it possible that these things that Christianity has, talking about that are, somewhat against what Moses spoke about, against the law, we say antinomian, that, maybe there's more of a nuance here. Maybe there's more of a middle ground here. Maybe there's something. If I'm going to be a Jew and a Christian at the same time, maybe there's something to that. And I wasn't able to just dismiss it because people say the Old Testament is for Jews, the New Testament is for Christian. I go, what about me? What am I supposed to do? Where do I fall? And so I couldn't walk away from that. And that's caused a wrestling match, which those of us in Judah, right? That's what we do. We wrestle.
Mm-hmm.
We wrestle. Jordan Peterson just came out with a book called We Who Wrestle with God, and that we should be wrestling with him. I don't think anybody who ever says to me, I'm comfortable in my faith, I say, I don't know faith like that. I don't think there is faith like that. We're trying to discover the ultimate, the unknown, the creator of the universe. So in this Messiah in the Middle, what we're doing is talking about topics from a Jewish perspective, Christian perspective, and then in the end, we meet back with Messiah because his perspective is really the only one that we're supposed to get as we are conformed into his image. So Sabbath rest is what we're tackling here. And I would just say, these arguments from a Jewish perspective, because Christianity, moved the Sabbath to Sunday. And so, but in the Bible, over and over again, it says the seventh day, the seventh day, the seventh day, the seventh day, the seventh day.
It's the only day of the week in the book of Genesis that has a name. All the other ones have numbers. Yeah.
So, and what is this? It's really a step outside time. It's a day when we rest. The 6 days we work, and then we step outside time. And Judy, and first I would say, look, people argue, okay, we don't keep the commandments anymore. But I said, well, we don't. There's not anarchy. And they say, well, which ones are still valid? They say the top 10, the 10. The 10 commandments. I go, okay, well, what about the Sabbath day? That's the fourth, like it's in there. And there's this thing, and if you know it, Catholicism doesn't have saying it's the Lord's day or that, that it was the day of the resurrection. The Catholic Church just says we had the right to move the day and we moved it.
Sure.
Then Protestantism comes along, 1,200 years later, and comes up with these reasons, these theological reasons that the people who moved it to Sunday because it was a day of worshiping the sun and all that, we know that within the paganism and stuff, it's there. Now, I'll say this, can we not worship God on Sunday? No, let's worship him every day in spirit and truth all the time. But God designated a day, and that seems important. Now, people say things regarding that of, well, the Sabbath is made for man, and so I get to do whatever I want with it. Okay, you can do that. They say Jesus is our rest, and that is true. By the way, very, very true. But as I had a good friend of mine years back who actually was a dean of a seminary, he said, you can't turn Saturday into Sunday. It's a day. It's the name of a day. It is what it is. And so what did God do on that day? He set it apart. And then many years later, he told his people that he had brought out of Egypt, I made it holy. I made you holy. This is a sign between me and you. And throughout the scriptures, God gets very upset with his people when they break his Sabbaths and they don't observe his Sabbaths. And that's a weekly Sabbath. That's yearly Sabbaths that happen. That's the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year. That he gets very upset. There's something about this that is very, very important to God. And so Christianity, when they moved it to Sunday, I have to say there used to be things like blue laws. I mean, Christians actually used to keep a Sabbath all day. Even in Colorado, you can't go car shopping on this day. There are laws that exist. But I would say, and I've seen this throughout my walk, that when you go from the literal of God and then turn it into some kind of other principle, pretty soon you're not keeping the principle at all. It becomes unhinged. And I would say to you as a Christian, do you actually have a Sabbath, regardless of the day? Are you actually observing a day of rest, of not doing your normal work, of doing these things? Why? Because God programmed us that way. He knows we need this day. I would argue that there's a real big spiritual reason to have it on the literal seventh day, because he's the king and he makes things up. But I would ask you, when was the last time you actually had a Sabbath? You know when mine was? Friday night to Saturday night of this week. And I can tell you that that's been going on for 30 years in my life, and I would never give it up. Jim, from how does Christianity, it seems to have sort of a negative attitude toward this and dismisses it.
Yeah, I think part of it, what we don't realize in the Christian church is a lot of Christians, even pastors, don't study church history. So we go back to Constantine. He did the Nicene Creed. Now, Constantine had claimed to have converted to Christianity, but he had declared Sunday an additional day of worship. Now, he didn't outlaw it. It was actually later, after Constantine, the Council of Corinth, they outlawed worshiping on Saturday, and you had to worship on Sunday.
Because they if you're going to be a Christian, you got to get rid of all the Jewish stuff.
Yeah,
that's completely divorce yourself from it.
Yeah, and later emperors then began to tax Jews more than everybody else, and so there were Christians who were Sabbatarian, who followed many of the Jewish customs and traditions, so they didn't want to be taxed. So we better change things up because they think we're Jews and we got to pay extra tax. So they started changing things up. That's culturally, historically, where it began to divide a bit more and more. And it started 1,800 years ago. And I think God's waking up the church and saying, hey, guys, read what I wrote. Study what I gave you. And so from a Jewish perspective, the word Sabbath in Hebrew is Shabbat, Shin, Bet, and Tav, right? Shin is like the teeth.
Those are the Hebrew letters.
The Hebrew letters, yep. And Bet or Beit is house in Hebrew. And Tav is a sign of a covenant, or the X that marks a spot. So if we think about it, even just in the word itself, the pictograph, we see something that's powerful. It's a covenant of the house where we make, and then of course the Sheen and Bet is Shuv, which is to repent.
And it is a sign of a covenant. It's the sign of creation. It's the covenant that was made at the end of creation when God set it apart. And in the traditional prayers that we do on Sabbath each week, it reminds us of that this is a remembrance of our set apartness and that he gave this as a sign. It's a remembrance of creation. It's also of our exodus from Egypt. And so we remember this. And, people in the ancient world thought Jews were lazy because they took a day off. I mean, we didn't, now we have 2-day weekends and we take holidays. You're just trying to survive. And by the way, still across the whole planet, mostly, if you don't work on any given day, you're not going to eat. You're going to die. And yet our God said, take the day off. I'll give you double manna. Chill out. My people get a rest. And then we have, Yeshua, that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Exactly. That's written in Mark. And Jim, how do Christians tend to turn that verse completely around and turn the Sabbath into something legalistic? Because I've heard that happen so often.
Sure. I think some of it is they get this idea that we're set free from the law because they read Paul and maybe don't understand him completely. Because Paul says you're supposed to follow the spirit of the law, not the letter.
Absolutely.
And in the spirit of the law. So, then that means if we're free, if Sabbath was made for man, then that means I can do what I want. That means
You're free to work yourself to death.
right, yeah. And so
Embrace the freedom.
yeah, exactly. And I was at a Messianic synagogue several years ago when I was church visiting, and great people. I love them. The Olive Tree. I know the rabbi there very well, and the rabbi emeritus. And a young man came to me and said, "Jim, you're a Christian pastor. Why do you break the law and worship God on Sunday instead of Saturday?" I said, "What makes you think I worship God one day a week?" I know your rabbi. He worships God 7 days a week, but we're supposed to rest on the Sabbath. And so I rest on the Sabbath. I go to church on Sunday. Is it a sin to go to church on Sunday? Absolutely not. We're not saying that at all. You can worship God 7 days a week, and you should. But let's think about resting on the Sabbath or taking a Sabbath rest.
Yeah, because this is something that's programmed into us. God made it part of what we need. We know this physiologically that we need it. When we come back, we're going to finish off, as we always do, Messiah in the middle by, how does Messiah look at it, and how can we come together as people of the book and observe what God wants, which is the best for us.
Amen. 100.7.
Okay.
The word.
So where are we going here?
Right.
I have this part of the calibration and rest and fellowship. Where do we want to bring this back and have a big Messiah in the middle?
Sure. Messiah in the middle idea would be, first recognizing that Jesus observed the Sabbath.
Okay.
Clearly, all throughout his life, he never broke the Sabbath rest. Now, he broke the additional rules the Pharisees wanted.
Why don't we address that?
Yeah.
So he observed it, but broke certain specific
additional rules that were put on it.
Right, and that's really important, because a lot of people would say, "Well, why would I do the Sabbath? Jesus broke it."
Right, because they assume he broke the Sabbath.
And say, well, if he broke the Sabbath, he actually would disqualify himself from being a Messiah.
Yeah.
So please don't say that. Let's look at what he did break.
And we can say the same thing about the Apostle Paul. He continued to observe the Sabbath his whole life. We can see in the book of Acts 85 different times. Because he said, and he went to this church in this city, and he went to the Sabbath every week to study the Torah. And
now the argument is, he was going just to convert Jews, but he
was still observing the Sabbath either way.
But why? Why did Paul? Why?
And Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, not the Jews. So why was he going to the Sabbath? Why was he going to the synagogue? That's where the Torah was. That's where you'd find a Torah scroll, and that's where you'd find God-fearing Gentiles who wanted to learn more about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Okay. Good.
And I think
I mentioned the pastor's keeping it.
Yeah, I'll mention that.
You because you know what? A lot of pastors, because they do work on Sunday, even though they call it the Sabbath, they work on Sunday, and they actually have Saturdays off. And we know more and more.
Right.
Secret Sabbath keepers.
Yeah. And then let's see. And then people's arguments usually on the Christian side is, well, in Acts it says they met on the first day of the week. But how does a Jew count the first day of the week?
Okay, can we fit all that in?
Well, we can squeeze it in quickly.
Yes, they rested on the Sabbath, and then they got together in the evening.
Yeah, which would have been from a Jewish tradition.
Which is why the guy fell asleep and fell out the window. He wasn't up from Sunday morning till Sunday evening.
Right.
And we still do that. I mean, we got to look. You and I got together last week.
Yeah,
we got together after the Sabbath.
We stayed up pretty late.
We got together after the Sabbath.
Fortunate, none of your kids fell out of a window.
We already did our windows.
And I think that's a powerful recognition, and that's what they call Havdalah in the current liturgy of the church.
Havdalah, is the ceremony to demarcate the end of the Sabbath.
Right. But then after Havdalah was the fellowship time, and if there was Messianic believers in that congregation.
Okay, I haven't heard that whole period called that, but I'm not saying it's not.
I'm not saying it's all called Havdalah, but it's an observance at the end of the Sabbath. 2 Corinthians, so I'll go to 2 Corinthians 3:6 because that's.
So I'll say ways to observe it. Don't do your normal work. Be intentional. I think we're back there. Welcome back to Crosswalk. I'm Chaim Goldman, the Watchman. I'm here with Pastor Jim Pierce from Springs of Living Water Church here in the Springs, and we're doing another Messiah in the Middle, talking about Sabbath rest. And so in this final section, we always seek to meet in the middle with Messiah and give some guidance as how to approach this. And I'll just say, yes, it is very easy to make the Sabbath a legalistic thing. It is. Judaism has broken it down. The work that we're not supposed to do, it's called malachot, and we don't know whether this is true or not, because you have to admit, how do we know what a word means? Well, orally transmitted, and the only people who've been studying this word and passing it down have been the Jewish people. So because there's a commandment for the Sabbath and then all the instruction for building the tabernacle, it was extrapolated that all of the functions of building the tabernacle, including tanning and woodwork and metalwork and all of these other things, are the definition of this word malachot, or work that we're supposed to not do on the Sabbath. The thing is that I have found is that we have a very personal relationship with God,
Right.
and that what the rest that you need based on the week that you had and the week that you're going to have, which only God knows that you're going to have, is a very personal rest. And I love this story. Many, many years ago, I was driving around the United States. I drove all the way up from Florida to Pennsylvania and went to a Messianic community there.
Mm.
They met in the morning, they met in the afternoon, and then we had a break in the afternoon. And there was a guy I'd been talking to and becoming friends with, never met before. And I said, hey, because it was on the Delaware Water Gap in Pennsylvania, and there were all these woods. I said, hey, we have this break. I've been driving all week. You want to go walk in the woods? And he was like, brother, I work for the National Park Service. All week I walk in the woods. That's the last thing I'm doing on the Sabbath. And it hit me what rest means, what setting aside your normal work is different for everybody. And so while we definitely need corporate rules, because I think that as a community, it would be great if we could pick a day,
Sure.
we could all take off and we could fellowship with each other. But what that rest means is quite individualistic. And
Right.
this is something that I don't even know if Judaism teaches, but it hit me as a broadcaster, as a radio person years ago, that, God, this is a little esoteric, but God is light, which means he's a particle in a wave, if we want to break that down. And so
Okay.
the wave, the frequency of God, you don't have to be like a prophetic master, seems to be 6+1. He loves that combination of 6+1, whether it be every week, whether it be years. And so I realized, within radio, we used to have to, now it's all digital, but we used to have to calibrate the signal, and you had to have 2 techs in ancient radio days all the time, because you couldn't go into another band. And I would say that this weekly calibration of working 6 days and the 7th day calibrates you. And God sets these days, and he says, if you read Leviticus 23, it says, these are my days, not Jewish holidays. These are my days that my people will keep at their appointed times, that I, as the master of the universe, set. And the very first one, you know what it is? It's the weekly Sabbath. And so while I would say that having a Sabbath during the week is really important, I know that Yeshua and the disciples and all the writers of the Bible kept the Sabbath, the 7th day.
Right.
And I believe that there's a benefit to it. Again, not for salvation, but as far as lifestyle, rest, and being a community. Jim?
So Yeshua, Jesus, he never broke the Sabbath. He always observed the Sabbath.
But now people claim, what about when he ate the showbread and all that stuff?
Well, yeah, that was David, of course. But Yeshua was using that to defend his disciples, because
they were picking grain.
Yeah, they're picking grain, which you're not supposed to harvest food on the Sabbath and work. Now, the disciples were fishermen, so picking grain wasn't work for them. And they weren't harvesting it so that they could sell it. They were hungry. They were, and it's implied in the story of Jesus' reply that they were starving. They were really hungry. And so when he ate of that, when they ate those grains, then the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teachers of the law said, well, they're eating it without washing their hands. And that was a whole other argument.
Now, what about healing on the Sabbath?
Oh, yes. I love that one. I love it. It's like he went out of his way to poke him in the eye. And then, so. But
pick up your bed, right?
Yeah. And they said, pick up your bed. But the guy that he told to pick up his bed didn't even know who healed him. Imagine that. You heal a guy born lame and walk away and nobody knows your name. That just blows my mind. And so in these situations where people say,
Jesus broke the Sabbath, I say two things. One, if he did, he's not the Messiah, because the Messiah couldn't sin, couldn't
Right.
break the law.
Right.
So please stop saying that, because you're declaring that Jesus isn't the Messiah. And I don't
Right.
believe that. I believe that he
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
But if you look at it, he never, ever broke an actual Torah commandment from Moses.
Right.
What he did do is break or possibly just bend
Right.
rabbinic
Halakha,
halakha, the
way we
way
walk.
that we walk, the way that we do things, the interpretations, in order to teach something else. And he said, of course, it's good. You would pull your animal out of a ditch on the Sabbath.
Right.
We heal on the Sabbath.
And,
we
and
do
some of these
good
things were actually
on the Sabbath.
prophecies from days before of what the Messiah would do, that he would heal the sick. He would heal someone who was born blind. The Messiah was prophesied to have done these things. And Jesus did those things, and he did them on the Sabbath to show that he was the Lord of the Sabbath.
And we even have, it's said that, pray that when these tribulation times come, that it's not on a Sabbath day that you need to flee. And I've heard people say, well, that's because Orthodox Jews would throw rocks at you if you were fleeing on that. It's like, no, it's because it's a day of rest, and pray that it doesn't happen on that. So,
Of course.
So Jim, I want to mention some things about that people can do to just sort of in a simple way, in a literal biblical way, to observe the Sabbath. But before I do, anything more that you have to say about Yeshua, Jesus, and the Sabbath?
One of the things I really like to when I talk about these things, I like to remind people what I'm saying is this is not your salvation. You're not saved by what you do or don't do. You're saved by the blood of Jesus, and him is washing you, and you're receiving his forgiveness. That's not a salvation issue. But as we begin to study, what is the Sabbath? What did God actually say? I like to remind people of 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 3. You show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone like the original Torah, but on tablets of human hearts, which Jeremiah and Ezekiel prophesied. I'll write a new covenant, which I'll write my law, my Torah in their hearts. Such confidence we have through Christ before God. Not that we are confident ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our confidence comes from God. He has made us confident ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter, legalism, kills, but the Spirit gives life. So if you're looking at the spirit of the Sabbath command to rest, which is in the 10 Commandments, you're going to rest. Now you got to wrestle with what that means between you and God. You got to say, Lord, am I to take Saturday off, or does it matter? What does the Scripture say? You got to come to a passionate, heartfelt conviction. Paul makes that clear. Don't let anybody judge you on what days you celebrate or don't celebrate, what holidays. But he says you've got to, number one, don't argue about it. Paul says that really clearly, right? People will argue about anything, the color of the wall, the sky, whatever. But we need to follow from a heart that is circumcised unto him.
And Hebrews 4:9 says, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Is it in Yeshua? Of course. Has it always been in Yeshua? Yes. He's the one that created the Sabbath in the first place when he created all things. Everything was made through him. So with 1 minute left, what is my advice? First of all, do it. Can you imagine a day when you can guiltlessly not do stuff? Like, is that legalism? Is that legalism to take the day off? If you're a workaholic like I am, it can be, but it's transformed me. I always do it no matter what's going on. And my family knows that they can count on it. But here's the deal. Don't do your normal work. Right. What does that mean to you? I'm not sure. You have to do it, because 6 days we work and then we take the seventh day off. We set it apart. It's holy. It's different. So make it different and be very intentional. It's going to be hard. A lot of it is a mind game,
right?
Setting the day apart. And there's a whole service that we do, because to be intentional as we're bringing in the Sabbath on Friday night, to be intentional about this, because it's very hard to put your work aside for most people. And yet we do, and it's a blessing. And guess what? When we come back, all the problems are still there.
Yeah.
But the world is still spinning, because we are not that important. And how great is our God.
Right. And spend time with him in that rest.
And then what does he want to do? Just like anything, he wants to spend time. He wants us to fellowship with others, love our neighbor, and love him. So don't make it about watching movies necessarily, or, reading books or whatever, but take the time off. Jim Pierce, thanks so much. Springsoflivingwater.co is the website for Jim Pierce. You've been listening to Crosswalk. and Messiah in the middle. I'm Chaim Goldman, the Watchman. My brothers and sisters, take a Shabbat, for God's sake.
Shalom, my homies.
For such a time as this. Shalom.
Well, that was better energy, I think. Each time we do it, we seem to synergize more and more. So that was fun.
We didn't do the secret pastors.
No, we didn't.
We didn't have the pastors.
We didn't have that. That's
okay. I'm going into. I have a citizen journalist meeting
10-4
starting in a few minutes.